All right. Hey, everybody. Um, Whoever's listening, whoever may be watching, the clock just struck a little after 4 o'clock in the morning where I am. So I'm feeling like I might have a little bit of that groggy. I just woke up because I did just wake up, and um, I don't know. I'm definitely an early riser, and I feel like the older I get, the more that I feel that I don't know if it's like a pull to wake up and get some things done. And certainly, there's something about waking up early that makes me feel closer to myself, my source. There's something really sacred for me about getting up in the time of day when it is really quiet and still and dark. And I meditate when I wake up early. And so I love to wake up early. And this morning, I woke up like a half an hour earlier than I normally would because I decided that I was going to record a podcast episode. And it's funny when you set an alarm, it's a little bit of a different wake up, I think. And I don't know, like I'm curious to do some looking into that a little further, but it's like I think it's sort of like disruptive to the psyche and to where we are in that dream space in a way that I don't think is great for us. Because I am saying that because when I woke up, I was a little bit like, and just like kind of panicked or like, I know I need to get up and I need to do this, but like I was excited when I went to bed to do it, and then I woke up and it didn't feel um, like it didn't feel good. It felt like, oh, and now I'm up and I'm like excited again. So I digress. Anyway, so I'm doing another solo episode. And when I first decided to record a podcast by myself, I remember just feeling like, yeah, but what am I going to talk about by myself? It just feels like an odd thing to sit and talk to myself whenever. And, I was like, I guess I could certainly talk about what feels like is alive in the collective in terms of what I hear coming up for clients. That's where my head was going because I don't watch the news anymore. It's been like a few years since I watched the news, and I certainly am aware of current events. I talk to people all day as a therapist, and I read and things, but I think there's something about like that constant news cycle that for me doesn't feel good. And I certainly attempt to support my clients in looking at what that brings up for them, because I think there's a way that we are just exposed to so much of what is happening in the entire world in a way that is really, again, difficult for our psyche to process. And if you think about how we as humans lived at one time, we weren't aware of anything outside of our, I don't know, however many mile radius of happenings. And so it's just a lot. And I think something that comes up with clients a lot is just feeling overwhelmed with like the the idea that like I'm not okay because I'm hearing all of these things are happening and I'm not able to do anything about all these things that are happening in the world. Um, and what do I do with that? And maybe I start with what I can do something about, which is like my immediate community, the people around me, maybe even the people in my household. And that actually, I think, is how we can take responsibility for creating the ripple that we want to see in the world, but not feel overwhelmed. And it's not from the space of like, I don't care about what's happening in the world. It's just, um, I am very, and it's interesting because I don't think I'm like a pragmatic person. Like I was about to say that. I was like, that's not true tonight. But I think I'm very like, I don't like to be in the space of, here's the problem. I'm going to sit and circulate in this problem. I like to, and this is where like my brain can be linear, is like I like to circulate around things that like I can do something about and figure out how to move forward with whatever this is versus just this is the problem and I feel sort of powerless. Anyway, um, so the reason I was bringing that all up was that I was like, when I was like, oh, I want to record a podcast episode, I remembered that I had put a call out for questions, topics, things that anyone might want to talk about if I were to start a podcast. And I got such a long list of topics, which thank you, whoever sent those in, super helpful, and keep them coming. Feel free to send me a DM or, I don't know, comment on this episode if you're watching it somewhere and just let me know about things that you are working out or maybe grappling with a little bit and you would be curious about being in the exploration of. But I picked for today a combination of a couple questions that I felt like were, do you guys hear my stomach growling? That was loud. A couple things that it felt like were sort of congruent or were similar in terms of what they were asking that I thought might be interesting to explore in terms of topics. So the questions that came up that I sort of merged into a couple questions were, how do I do this thing of balancing the sovereignty that you talk about while in connection or in a marriage? And Dené, will you talk about social justice through the lens of sovereignty? And yes, absolutely. I would be happy to, because I think this is just, I was about to say something that I feel really passionate about, but it's also like the lens through which I experience the world around me when I talk about this space of being a sovereign being and what it means to do relationships and do life and grapple with the inevitable things that are happening in the world. It's always through the lens of what I'm going to talk about in terms of personal responsibility. And listen, this podcast is called What's My 100% for that reason. And I think I talked about that a little bit in the first episode of the podcast, why that feels like such the way that I experience the world around me and sort of orient towards how we move forward with anything that is happening in any given moment. But yeah, I think that when we talk about sovereignty, it is this space of, if the buck stops with me, if I don't get to be a victim of anything in this life, then how am I going to hold whatever this is, right? And, I think people can really sometimes feel challenged with something that I say often. And it's one of those spaces where I'm like, I don't care. I'm joking. I care, but it's just what's true for me. And I think that I get to have the experience of what feels true for me. And that I will often say, I don't like to be a victim. I feel almost sometimes allergic to the experience of um, experiencing myself as a victim, or that this thing that I'm going through, moving through, should not be happening to me. And it's, again, I think something that I experience for myself is not me placing the experience of shame on anyone else if that is how they're orienting or experiencing the world in this moment. And I think a lot of times when we feel activated by something someone says, like if I say, and I know I have said this and it's been very activating to people in the past, if I say, I feel like I'm allergic to being a victim, sometimes that will be really activating, and someone will say, well, there are actual victims and people are victimized, and that's a really terrible thing for you to say. And I think is important to sort of circle back around in that response, is that I in no way am suggesting that there aren't victims. I am saying, for me, in the way that I process the world, I don't like to sit in the space of, this shouldn't be happening to me. This should not have happened to me. I am being victimized by this circumstance. And I say that because I think, honestly, there were so many years of my life that maybe I did experience the world from a certain level of victim consciousness. And so much of my healing has been around in, no, Danae, we don't get to do that anymore. If I am a victim of nothing, if life is always happening for me to support me in becoming the person, the human that I have the potential to become, if I am always being expanded by the curriculum of this moment in any given moment. What am I learning? How am I growing? And a lot of times, what I think is like the potent inquiry is, how am I being prepared for whatever it is I am meant to do next, become the next iteration of self through this thing, right? Like, how am I being prepared through that? And it just feels like a very different way of holding whatever the thing is. And to me, that's so much of how I experience this thing of sovereignty. It's that it's always my responsibility. And I remember that there was a point when I started to realize that there was something so empowering in not needing anyone to be different than they are, for me to really like take responsibility for how I was experiencing the moment. And I think that as a therapist, what I have found is often so much of where our sort of cognitive dissonance and where we get stuck in loops of behavior patterns and ways of showing up that aren't in alignment with what we know we want for ourselves. And certainly, like, the parts of ourselves that we end up not really being proud of are the resistance to what is and why it should be different, right? And so I know for me, when I learned to surrender, everything about my life changed. And that surrender was that, you know, I get to be a work in progress. I get to be in the space of becoming. I don't have to do any of this perfectly. And I am responsible for my life. But in that responsibility, there's actually great power. I get to be in the space of challenging the way I'm thinking about this in a way that makes me feel a little bit more empowered versus thinking about whatever the thing is in a way that makes me feel defeated, or if only this person weren't this, then I would be able to be in this space of forward momentum. Because the thing is, like, the only person that we ever get to be in control of is ourselves, right? And so when we talk about this in the context of, I'll start, I guess, with relationships, um, and then we'll move on to social justice in a little bit. But I think they're important because to me, and this is why I love so much the work that I've gotten to do over the last several years and this like relational work. And I think so much of what I feel is like my soul's dharma around why I feel such a strong pull to understand how we relate to one another and what is happening in our interactions with one another, is I think there's something around coming into our soul's awareness of how we're processing this and what this relationship is meant to teach me about myself, that I think, well, certainly collectively we are starting to awaken to. But that's, that's just like again, a different way of orienting towards the world. And so we'll talk about that in terms of social justice and why I think that whatever is happening in the micro in our individual relationships is very similar and often impacts how we're processing the macro and the world around us and what's happening and what shouldn't be happening and should, and all of those things, right? And so when we think about balancing sovereignty and connection in our relationships, and in this context, the person was asking about in our marriages or partnerships, it's that thing of really checking in with myself around like where I am allowing something outside of me to define my experience of the world, right? And so I often say that what has become clear to me is that in any given moment, I am choosing a narrative. And there's normally like two paths to the narratives I'm choosing. I can choose a narrative that makes me feel really defeated, or I can choose a narrative that makes me feel a little bit more empowered. Now, even as I say that, I'm always sort of aware in the back of my mind, I think, because I have conversations all day with pushback, that I'm aware of the pushback that can bring up. And that's like, oh, so I'm always supposed to be choosing a narrative that makes me feel more empowered. And what I would say is, I think one, it's about the awareness of the narrative that I'm choosing, not what I'm choosing, right? So it's not sort of bypassing the truth of what feels accessible to me, because there will be moments, there will be times where a more empowering narrative doesn't feel accessible to me. And it's not to shame ourselves for that. It's just to notice, like, th- that's where I am right now. And something that I find and share with clients a lot in terms of a phrase that can be really empowering is like, this is just where I am right now. This is not where I will always be. But a lot of times, I think where we get into the space of suffering is feeling like whatever I'm feeling right now um, is what it always has to be. But I think the conscious awareness is, this is where I am right now. I'm sure at some point I will feel different. If I go to bed and get some rest, I might feel different. If I wake up tomorrow, I may have a different conversation with myself about this, right? So that's the first point, is that I think it's just bringing into my conscious awareness how I'm processing this, not making myself wrong for it, but noticing, oof, it feels a little bit difficult or inaccessible to me right now to come up with a narrative in my head that makes this feel a little bit more empowering to me, right? But the other thing is that we can sort of move ourselves up the emotional scale of something that feels just like a little bit more empowering than the way I'm holding this right now. So, trying to think of an example. Um, let's say relationally, that I'm trying to think, I'm in a marriage and I just feel like, I always feel like I'm doing everything and I'm alone, even though I'm in a relationship with someone else. I think that's something that comes up commonly, right? And so when I think about that, like, I'm in this marriage and I'm always going to feel alone. I'm always going to feel like this is just an impossible situation. And I don't feel met and I don't feel seen in this dynamic, right? So when I think that, there's like a physical response in my body that feels like a really sort of, I don't feel empowered by that. That feels sort of like defeating. And that feels just like, oh, that feels not good when I think about it that way, right? And so, what might feel a little bit more empowering if I thought about it this way? Certainly, this today, in this dynamic, I'm feeling X, right? And if it's like, yeah, I feel that way a lot in my head, right? Sometimes what could be a little bit better of a feeling is I'm learning to stay with myself in the space of not feeling met. I'm learning to really love myself through that, right? And I'm proud of myself for really trying to do that. That starts to feel a little bit better, right? Um, the next thing up the emotional scale might be, I'm learning that it can feel challenging for me to talk to my partner about how I'm feeling. So I'm learning to do that, and I'm getting better at it slowly as I start to play with it, as I start to practice it. And I want to talk a little bit today because I think I've, been talking about some of the ways that, like, tangibly we do this thing of like being in connection to other people while being a sovereign being. And sometimes, when I work with clients or even in groups, like, we'll talk about like how to tangibly do that. And I want to share that with you all in a podcast episode as well, because I think it can be useful. But the emotional scale thing is like reaching for something that feels a little bit better, right? And so, like, one other example of like what might feel better is like, yeah, I feel a little bit defeated and alone in this dynamic, and I feel really lucky that I have friendships that feel supportive of me where I am, and that I can sort of utilize as an outlet or a space that feels good and safe and whatever I long for them to feel. Those are that for me as well. So those are just like a couple examples of ways that we can reach for a thought that makes us feel a little bit better until I am feeling like it is accessible to me to really meet this moment in a way that feels more empowering, right? And so it's just playing with the inquiry. And I think so much of our work around personal responsibility is bringing our thoughts into our conscious awareness, right? And so we aren't sort of ruled by the thoughts that we are thinking. We're paying attention to the thoughts that we're thinking, but also how the thoughts that I'm thinking make me feel. So if I'm thinking a thought of I'm in a marriage that makes me feel not met and really alone, how does that make me feel when I think that, right? Does that feel good when I think that? And again, it's not to make ourselves wrong for it. It's just to pay attention to if I am throughout the day thinking several thoughts that make me feel defeated, that starts to be my experience of life, right? And I start to experience life in that vibration. And the world around me, life around me starts to be reflective of um, the vibration that I am sort of experiencing myself in the world through. That's I think a couple episodes we were talking about like that red car theory, and so that's that, right? So, um, yeah. So I think it's really that it is. If we talk about like what it is to balance sovereignty and connection to another person, I think to me, the beautiful thing about sovereignty in our relationship dynamics is that it just brings a lot more harmony from my perspective because we're not in resistance to another person, kind of period, right? Like I'm just not in resistance to who this person is. And the resistance is who you are, what you're doing, how you're showing up should not be the way that it is. I need you to change this. And I think so much of what our relationship modalities have been up to this point have really been how do we get someone else to change? How do we get someone else to compromise? How do we get someone else to be something other than who and what they are showing up as in this moment in order for me to feel better in our dynamic? And in my experience, I don't find that often is a sustainable strategy because life will come up. We will have ways that we are feeling challenged by something that someone does. That's just a part of our human relationships and interactions. But if I constantly need to get this person to change in order for me to experience a sense of peace and harmony in my skin, first of all, I thought I heard something. First of all, that becomes pretty disempowering in our dynamic for me when that person becomes in resistance to changing. But also, I think a lot of times it's missing whatever I am meant to gain in terms of perspective or in terms of my own personal growth. Um, because a lot of times it's like you get to have whatever you want in your relationship dynamics, but your work is really to be curious about why you want the thing that you want. And I find that so often we are attempting to maneuver someone into a different space than where they are because we believe it will make us more comfortable. Whereas if we can really be in that inquiry that we've been talking about around why do I need this? What's the story I'm telling myself I would feel if I had this? Then we can get into some of the deeper layers of like what might be perceived as our shadow work or, um, you know, how we're sort of moving through whatever our dynamic is with a narrative that makes me feel a little bit disempowered. And there might be another way to hold this, right? And so, what does that look like to then be in connection with another person if I'm always in the space of taking personal responsibility that I like am this sovereign being and that I'm not a victim of anybody else's way of showing up in our dynamic or in the world? And um I need to communicate. I need to be able to be connected to you and bring you in on my process of like how I'm experiencing whatever this is, right? And so I feel like what has been a game changer for me in terms of certainly the way that I interact with people, but also the way that I started working with couples was that I started to bring in this thing that I like to call offensive communication. Um, into the way that I sort of attempt to support people in connecting with their partners, right? So, this thing of offensive communication is really just how do I sort of attempt to not, it's funny. I think of like when, like offensive versus defensive, like the thing about like we're defensive a lot of times in our dynamics with another person because whenever someone brings a challenge they have with us, a complaint about the way that we've been showing up, or really even sometimes make a request of us, we can be in that space of defensiveness for two reasons. One, I think there's something in our human psyche that is always sort of defending against being perceived as a bad person, being perceived as bad in general, feeling like another person is criticizing us or sees us as not capable or strong or able to do whatever the thing is. It's just sort of how we're built, right? And so if someone else is instructing us, it's like our inner teenager comes in, guys, and is just in resistance. So if I'm going to use the dishwasher example because I've been doing couples therapy work for so long, and I can't even tell you how much conversations around the dishwasher and the trash come out. And I'm like, at some point, I'm going to do a study around like why these are such like prevalent points of contention. And I think it's like these are the household tasks that feel like I don't feel like emptying the dishwasher or I don't feel like taking the trash out. Now, here's what's interesting to me about taking the trash out or emptying the dishwasher. I don't think that I thought a ton about like those two tasks. And listen, when I say those two tasks, I'm using them as examples of the types of tasks or things that we get into, these swirly places with our partners that start to build resentment, right? Like I'm always the one who takes the trash out. I'm always emptying the dishwasher or putting things in the dishwasher because you're always leaving dishes in the sink. It's always a mess and it's always my responsibility to clean it up, right? Now, um, I don't know anybody who's ever been in a long-term partnership relationship who can't sort of relate to those types of things coming up in our dynamic. But here's what's important and something that I wrote about in my book, Sovereign Love, that I started to notice within myself and in my own life that really informed what I was seeing in the couples that I was working with. And what it is that we start to feel entitled. That's a big word we don't love to hear, but entitled is the word I'm going to use. We start to feel entitled to our partner being like our release valve. I was like, how to describe this, and it's like I have tension around whatever this thing is, and it's like you become the place that I sort of channel or direct that energy around something that makes me uncomfortable. Meaning, um, at this point, I live alone. And so, well, I don't live alone. I live with a child part of the time because I co-parent with my child's father. But I don't ever really feel tension around things that have to be done, like taking the trash out or, the dishes in the dishwasher. And a lot of why I don't feel that tension is because, my son's 8, he just turned 8, but for the most part, he doesn't share those responsibilities with me. So I don't feel a lot of energy around someone else should be doing this because I'm just in radical acceptance of like, if someone's going to take out the trash, it's going to be me. That's my responsibility because I live here. I make trash. It's just, it is what it is. I don't even think about it. The trash gets full. I take it out. There's no energy there. I'm not sort of in that space of resistance around it. I'm not even really thinking, oh, I wish there was someone else to take out the trash. I don't know. I don't think about it because I'm here. I'm the person to take out the trash. Now, I don't know if I actually was the one in my previous relationship that had tension around taking out the trash. It might have been the other person feeling like not necessarily that I should take out the trash. I think that was something that my ex just did or felt like was like his thing, I guess. But there were certainly other things that it felt like you should be doing more of these things. You should be picking up your fair share of the responsibility with these things. And I'm sure I had them too, in terms of things that maybe I felt like I wanted him to do more, right? But I think there's something potent in understanding that if this person weren't here, that I am in relationship with, feeling like they're not picking up their fair share of this, I wouldn't feel that tension. I wouldn't feel entitled to someone supporting me in half of this work, but I do because they're here, right? And I think that can sort of be spread across so many of the things that we are wishing that our partner were doing more of. We're sort of like sitting back with our arms crossed, taking our inventory of what they've done versus what I've done. I call that sort of titting for tatting and like scorekeeping and all of those things that, like, inevitably, they're very human things that come up in our relationship dynamics. But the work is to challenge ourselves to be in the inquiry of, right, of like, am I entitled to whatever this thing is from my partner? And when I feel entitled to it, how does that feel? How does that make me feel? Does that make me feel empowered, or does that make me feel defeated? Now, this is not me saying, in order to have relational harmony and live together, that we don't need to sort of divide and conquer tasks and that we can't make requests and ask our partner for support. But I think there's a very specific energetic that is evoked within my partner when I ask for something from them from the space of entitlement. And I'm sort of making that face because, I think having been in a partnership, in a long-term partnership, and then having the experience of not being in that partnership, what I sort of realized was that there was a point where I felt entitled to things from my partner that were actually just like really beautiful, nice to haves, but I didn't need them for my survival. And I think sometimes feeling like I needed someone else to do certain things for me became a crutch or a limitation or ways that I was not continuing to develop within myself because I was believing that I needed someone outside of me to do things or to make me whole, right? Um, and yeah, so I think it's just like, sometimes people will say to me, okay, well, Danae, if that's true, then like, what are we entitled to from our partner? And I would say very little, like maybe nothing. And you get to decide if you want to be in a partnership. Like, these are optional, these things of partnerships in, 2025, we get to choose whether we want to be in relationships or not. And that's like the personal responsibility piece, right? Like, I am actually choosing this relationship dynamic now. And I want to get into this in a minute. There's a whole other host of things that come into when we choose to be in partnership dynamics or not. It's not just a flippant thing I'm saying, even though I am sort of saying in a tongue in cheek way. We are choosing this relationship dynamic, but it becomes, I'm also choosing the energetic that I bring into it, right? And so when we think about how we balance being sovereign and being in connection, it's really like, how do I stay with myself, take responsibility for myself while I am attempting to connect with you? And that's from the space of like, I take a lot of responsibility for how I speak to you, what I'm speaking to you about, the story I'm telling myself about what this is. And a lot of times that's bringing us into that space of the offensive communication that we're talking about. So if we bring it back to the example of the trash or the dishwasher, let's do the trash because I feel like, I don't know. I don't really, it's interesting, y'all. I don't have a ton of energy around taking the trash out. I feel like there's something about taking out the trash that feels sort of like cleansing for me. It's like, oh, new, fresh trash. But I know a lot of people really don't enjoy it. So I will use that example, right? And let's say I have just been taking out the trash for a long time and I've noticed that my partner has not been taking out the trash. I'm sort of doing an inventory of how many times I'm taking out the trash versus the number of times they're taking out the trash. And I'm starting to feel a lot of resentment building and a lot of like, as I'm taking out the trash, I'm watching you and I'm just feeling that sort of contemptuous energy of like your laziness and watching me do things and not taking responsibility for doing your fair share. And all that energy is sort of percolating inside of me, inside of me, right? Now, I have options. I could sort of say to my partner, this is not fair. I'm always the one taking out the trash, and I need you to pick up your fair share a little bit, or, pick up some of the slack around taking out the trash right now. Here's what ends up happening. If I go to my partner in that way, my partner is going to go straight into defensiveness, and they're going to think of every example of the number of times they took out the trash and why what you're saying isn't true. They're going to give me examples of times they took out the trash. They're going to just like, we're going to get into some circular talk about them in the space of defending themselves around why they 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 do things just as much as I do, and that's not fair that like they never take out the trash. So a big thing in terms of like this is sort of historic couples therapy. Um the always and the never statements with our partner are always like where we lose each other, right? So the minute I say to my partner, you always do this or you never do this, we're in dangerous territory because my partner's not going to hear me anymore. They're just going to start to come up with their defense all of the times that they've done whatever it is. If I say never or always, and they're going to start to come up with like the discrepancies and why that's not true. And this isn't something that they always do, right? And so what I find is just a lot more productive is to go about the thing of attempting to connect with my partner from that space of personal responsibility. And that's the thing of using offensive communication to make a request. And it's a 3-step process. And I'm going to share it with you guys now. So the first step is that I name that I'm doing something hard or that I'm nervous to talk to you about whatever this thing is, right? And this first step of naming that the thing I'm doing is hard is really about softening my partner's defenses, right? So I name that this is something that is hard, and it's like somehow that brings my partner into the space of holding space for me, for seeing me versus like defending themselves. Um, and so if I say, babe, I've been sitting with something and I want to talk to you about it, but I'm a little bit nervous to talk to you about it because I don't want you to feel like attacked or that you know, that I'm like criticizing you. So I'm nervous to talk about it, but I feel like I want to bring something up and I want to see if you have a few minutes to get into it, right? And so I've sort of prepped my partner for this is hard for me. So they're sort of listening with a little bit more of an empathetic, hopefully compassionate ear than if I just came in and say, you never take out the trash, then they're sort of in that like defending themselves mode, right? So the first step is that I name that I'm doing something hard. The second step is that I take personal responsibility for my part in whatever this challenge is. And so it's like all the I statements that we're sort of still circulating in, right? And so if it's the trash, it's like, I want to own that I've been taking out the trash a lot and I haven't really talked to you about the fact that I like wish there was a way um, that we could divide and conquer. Or sometimes I feel overwhelmed by taking out the trash when I'm, I don't know, balancing all of the things that I need to get done for our kiddo. And it feels like a lot of, you know, just like another thing on my to do list that starts to make me feel like I have so many things to do. And I start to feel a little bit bogged down by that. Right. And so I take responsibility. And a big part of taking responsibility can be my own inquiry around like that thing I was saying of like you get to want whatever you want, but you have to take responsibility for why you want it. So if I want my partner's support, if I would like my partner's support in taking out the trash part of the time, or maybe asking them if that's something they would take over for a while in terms of our responsibilities, I have to get clear why that's something I want from them. Like, why does that matter? Why is that important to me? Why does that even need to be a thing? And so if I do that inquiry on my own, it might be something like, I always was responsible for taking out the trash in my childhood. And it just felt like, mom wasn't around and it was like another thing that I had to do all the time. And my brothers and sisters were my responsibility too, because I was the oldest. I'm making this up. I'm not the oldest, but, and it always felt like all of these tasks were on me. And it's like every time I take out the trash, I'm sort of reminded of how I felt that like mom wasn't around, dad wasn't around, whoever, and I had to do all the things. And it always felt like everything's my responsibility. And every time I take out the trash, I sort of feel that again. Everything's my responsibility. So as I take responsibility, I might bring my partner in on that narrative if I've done some of that inquiry work myself and I've landed on, like, yeah, this feels historic. This feels like the thing that I always had to do as the oldest child. And I notice it comes up for me. And it's just like I tell myself a story that I am still the person that has to do a lot of the tasks around the house, and that just doesn't feel good. And I wanted to bring you in on that, right? I wanted to share that with you. So then the last step after I have named that this is a hard thing to do and take responsibility for why I want the thing that I want, and maybe why I haven't brought this up sooner, whatever sort of responsibility I can take for my part in the dynamic and why this is coming up for me as a request that I'm making. The third step is I ask for support. I make a request, right? And that can sound like, and so given those variables that I was just telling you about, I'm wondering, would you be willing to support me in us coming up with like a plan for how we can divide and conquer the trash? Now, I like to say it that way. A lot of times, like this thing of like how we can divide and conquer, because it's again, it's sort of not directive. It's not sort of like, this is what I need you to do, and you need to do this thing. And the reason I say that is, again, I find there is just like a dormant inner teenager in all of us that doesn't want to be told what to do. I don't know why we're like this. We're just like this. We want to feel like we have autonomy and that we get to have agency around the things that we decide to do or not in any given day. And as adults, even when we are in a partnership or a marriage, we don't like that feeling that is evoked within us when it's like a parental energy or someone outside of me is dictating how I should spend my time and what I should be doing. Now, again, we can go around and around about like how fair that is, or like, well, I have to do the things, and sure, like we can do that. But again, if you had no partner there, you wouldn't be able to dictate anything to anyone. It would just be your responsibility. And this is, I think, a lot of times where I differ um, as a couples therapist or someone who does this relational work, and that I actually don't feel like we are entitled to the energy of having another person here to support me. I think it is a luxury and a privilege. And some people go an entire lifetime taking out their own trash with no one else there to support them in that. And if I didn't have this person, I would still, the trash would need to go out. But because it is a gift to have this person in my life who could conceivably support me in that, how do I treat it as such, right? Like, how do I hold a certain level of reverence for the fact that having this person that I can even make this request of is something that I'm not entitled to and is ultimately a beautiful thing to have, right? And certainly that's like a reciprocal thing. It's a beautiful thing for both of us to have one another. But I find the more that I take personal responsibility for treating my partner as though having them in my life is a gift that I'm not entitled to, that becomes the energetic frequency and the vibration that sort of rises between us. So I take responsibility for the energy I want to meet my partner in, and hopefully they start to meet me there. Now, here's the important point. If my partner is not able to meet me there, if my partner is, still in resistance, still becomes defensive, and I have to be really honest with myself about the actual energy that I'm bringing to my partner. Because a lot of times people will say to me when I give this example or describe this, yeah, I've tried that. And they're still, and I'm like, even in that energy of I've tried that, there is resistance and there is an energy of I am defeated. I'm not willing to try. My heart is sort of closed to possibility. And I promise, and listen, I say this without a hint of righteousness because I've been there, but I promise on some level, you are bringing that same energetic frequency to your partner and they feel it because we are energetic and we feel one another's energy. So if my partner feels the energy of, you're not going to do this for me, and I've asked several times and I just don't believe in your propensity to change, they will respond to you with that same energetic frequency, right? Like they will be in resistance, they will be in defensiveness, they will defend against being seen that way. Whereas if you go to your partner with just such open hearted vulnerability, and you are willing to believe that, we're on the same team, and I know that you're the person I can bring these tender spots of myself and what I'm struggling with, then they will feel like, yeah, I want to be your partner in this because I see your soul. I see your vulnerability. I don't want to be against you. You're my partner, right? But it's a little bit like all of us softening our rough edges around um just what we feel like we are seeing when we look at another person. And listen, again, this is one of those places where it's not lost on me because I have been in a long-term relationship where that's felt hard. And I promise you, it's absolutely possible to start to shift that dynamic between us at any time. And I feel like I'm often like I'm living proof that that's possible. It may not always be in the same container or in the same way, but I think like with my kiddo's dad, it's amazing to me how much there's an allyship and a reverence and a way that we meet one another with so much compassion, and certainly don't do it perfectly, but most of the time. And it's just because honestly, I don't feel entitled to anything from him. And so anything that he does do for me or in support of me and our child today, I feel really grateful for. And there's something about the energetic of gratitude that just creates more of that energy of abundance and flow and things just starting to feel like a really harmonious dynamic versus the energy of resistance, right? And so yeah, we start with the offensive communication and those 3 steps one more time, just in case you want to try them out with someone in your life. Or the first step is I name that I'm doing something hard. So that's bringing ourselves into that space of vulnerability, telling this person I'm nervous to talk about this, but I'm trying to do this thing of talking about things versus holding on to resentment, right? The second step is that I take responsibility for why I'm making this request and maybe why I haven't brought this up yet in the past. And just like really taking a lot of ownership of my part in this thing that I'm asking of you. And then the third step is that I ask for support. I ask for your buy in. And, you'll notice in those 3 steps, there's very little conversation about that person and what they're doing or not doing. It's very much me taking responsibility for something that I am grappling with, I am sitting in, that I would really love to have some support with, and asking for another person's willingness to meet me there. I'm asking for consent versus feeling like I am making a demand of someone. And, any of you who know me know that I struggle a lot of times with the conversation that comes up and I think a lot of this started with the nonviolent communication way of talking relationally, and there's so much beauty and what is so unbelievably useful. Please don't misunderstand me um, in utilizing nonviolent communication. And I feel like there's a way that, to me, what is like the part that I struggle to connect the dots with, or that just doesn't feel aligned for me, is that we have needs that it is one other particular person's responsibility to meet for us, right? I can certainly make a request. I can certainly ask for consent from that other person. But if that other person is unwilling, doesn't have the capacity for whatever reason, is in resistance to meeting me there. I think I find a lot of times with couples that we can sort of get in this space of like being in a standoff, or we're not able to move forward. If I see this as a need that I have, that I need you to meet for me to be able to exhale and be okay. And I would say a lot of times the things that we are classifying for ourselves as needs are actually desires, maybe nice to haves, things that would feel supportive. And again, it's not that we don't have needs, but I think how we're in relationship to our needs is really important. So if it's like, I need this person, this one specific person to meet this need in this one specific way, we can get into some murky territory here, right? Because that can feel like a little bit of an outsourcing of my power. I need this person to comply with whatever I need them to do in this moment for me to feel okay. And that's just not in my belief system. I don't actually believe that I need any other human being to do anything for me to decide how I'm going to feel in my body and in my system, right? Um, but also, I think that there's just a way that we're not really holding the reverence that I was talking about for what it is to have another person here. And I don't think we're promised relationships. And I think to me, that was like the big shift in my perception when my marriage ended. Because I think for so many years, I just sort of took for granted this relational dynamic would be there and would be present. And certainly now, as a couples therapist who a lot of times I do facilitate or hold space for the dissolution of partnerships or marriages. And so it's just, I think I have that visceral sense that maybe people who don't have these conversations in their day to day lives, that we're not promised that this dynamic is going to be here. And so I think there's something that we can see as like destabilizing in that, when that makes me feel unsafe that I don't know that this is always going to be here. Or and this would be my preference. It's that thing I often say that if nothing is promised, then everything is sacred. And I think we can really make it like a mindfulness practice to bring that into our relationship dynamics. Like if I'm not promised tomorrow with you, how do I want to show up and love you today? Right? How do I want to hold that having you in my life is a gift, and I want to treat it with that level of respect and reverence and really hold you as something that is sacred in my life, right? Hold you as someone that is sacred in my life. And it's such a practice, and it's not something to be in sort of like rigidity with ourselves about or upset with ourselves about when it feels like we're falling short or struggling to get there. That will be a part of our human experience. But I think sometimes feeling like we can't do something perfectly can be a way that we create barriers to even trying. And what I have found is if we hold this as like the North Star that I want to come back to, or this is like the thing that I want to hold as the larger truth, we can surprise ourselves with how often we can show up as that version of ourselves, or um, our ability to take responsibility for being the love that we want to experience. We can surprise ourselves with how much more often it is accessible than we believe it might be, right? Big breath. And so when we think about this through social justice, or just like the world around us and how we hold that in terms of sovereignty, I think it's the same thing around how do I take responsibility for being what I want to experience? And I think there's a way that I have been watching, well, specifically for the last couple years. I think this has always been the case, but it's just like I've noticed it more, that we can be in a really codependent dynamic with the world around us, and just like really sort of pointing the finger outward and saying, when this group does this, this happens in the world, and I can't have peace because of, this political party that I don't agree with, or this leader that is challenging to me. And to me, that again becomes an outsourcing of my power. And it's this thing of like, when I'm not outsourcing my power, what does that look like in terms of how I frame it or how I hold it? And that is, if this person never changes one iota, what am I going to take responsibility for changing within me in order to hold this in a way that makes me feel more empowered, right? And so that's it. Like that to me is the answer. And so I don't focus my energy on what I am not able to change. I channel that energy into something that makes me feel more empowered, which is okay, but who are the people doing things and creating things in the world that make me feel empowered when I see what they're doing or what they're creating or what they're building? Is there a way for me to be a part of that, right? Or how do I bring things, if we take it into what I was saying about like the news cycles and what that brings up for us collectively, how do I start to, like, within my community, see where I can have an impact, where I can take responsibility for starting to be some of what I want to see more of, the love that I want to see more of in the world. And as I do that, noticing how not only that shifts my perception of reality, but also how that creates that ripple in the world, right? Like how I can be a part of creating shifts in the collective perception and how people are experiencing the world. I'll tell you guys a story. Um, I remember once I was working at a spa and it's like quick story, but I remember that I was sort of, joking, laughing with one of my coworkers, and we were like having fun. And then our manager at the time came out, and I watched as she said something to my coworker that was like, I think she was sort of correcting her on something that she'd done. And she said it in a way that was like really harsh and sort of demeaning. And I watched sort of the energy deflate from my coworker as they were interacting with our manager, right? So I'm watching all of this. And the reason I'm bringing this in is because it was one of my first, um, like, I don't know, you have these moments sometimes where it's like, oh, I'm noticing something about energy and how we interact with one another and it creates a ripple. And so the manager in this case walked away, and I watched as my coworker was very different energetically with me, but then how the energy that she started to meet everyone who came in to visit the spa for the rest of the day was very different. It was very sort of hostile and with animosity and with a lot of energy of just not welcoming. And that had not been the case before our manager came in and spoke to her in that way. And the reason I think it matters is there's a way that if our manager had spoken to her in a way that, you know, held a certain level of reverence for her and her feelings, allowed her to have a sense of dignity in the fact that I was standing there, someone else was watching that conversation. I think there's so much about when I think of what sovereignty is in terms of this thing of like, activism or social justice, it's really attempting to like think about one, the big picture of these moments, but also mindful of how like the human beings that I am interacting with are experiencing whatever this is. And me sort of acting from that space of being the change that I want to see and really noticing how that creates a ripple, right? So if I want there to be more compassion and more reverence for people and, diversity and, just everyone to be safe, I gotta be that. And I gotta be that sometimes with people that I don't agree with. And then as I take responsibility for doing that, I hopefully get to see how that creates a ripple. But it's that thing of like, let it begin with me. Let me be that thing that I want to see. It's always just like bringing it back inward to what I can control. And so I think a lot of times, when I talk about this thing of personal responsibility, and I think I told, or I think I said this in one of the earlier episodes of the podcast that, Wayne Dyer, who was one of my favorite spiritual teachers, still is, but he used to talk a lot about self-reliance. And that was the way that I heard him speak about this thing of sovereignty. And I have shifted it to the space of personal responsibility because I think when people hear the word self reliance, what they hear is hyper individualism or hyper independence. And there's a way that when I talk about sovereignty, I am very much talking about being an interdependent, relating with other people. It's just from the space of like really being mindful about how the person I'm relating to is going to experience me in our exchange. And I take responsibility for the energetic frequency that I want to exist between us. Like I take that responsibility. I don't wait for the other person, right? Big breath. Okay, so, ooh, I've been talking for an hour. I mean, there's nothing like the conversation around sovereignty that gets your girl going. But I did pull a card, and um, this is from the deck that I pull from every morning after I meditate. And here's someone gave me the feedback or asked that I put whichever card I'm pulling from in the show notes. And I'm going to go back and do it for the other show notes because I just saw it, I think, on a YouTube comment. And I'm going to make sure and I do that moving forward. Thank you for that feedback. Want to give, just like shout outs and make sure that we're crediting the people that are creating these beautiful decks, but I have to go back and watch the end and see which deck I used in each episode. So it'll take me a minute. But this is from the Intuitive Night Goddess Tarot, which has just become one of my favorite decks in the world. And there was a time when I used to get myself as like a New Year's gift, a new deck every year. But this, for the last few years, maybe like almost 3 years, has been the deck that I have been pulling from because I just love it so much. And so the card that I pulled, I am going to show you, is so beautiful. So it's the Wayfarer, which is in most decks traditionally the Lover's card, right? I'm going to put my glasses on so I can read this. But the Wayfarer, and the description for this card is: a goddess ventures alone on her journey and comes to a crossroads. Each path is illuminated by 6 candles, totaling 12 in reference to the astrological houses and the cycles we go through. A wayfarer is a journeyer, often on foot, and this means you are on a path where it's okay to go at your own pace. The wayfarer's right arm holds apples, denoting knowledge, and her left has a snake wrapped around it, referencing the union of Adam and Eve, but also how the snake gets an underserved negative reputation. This card offers the reader a choice to meditate on ideas of self-love. The lovers are the union of separated parts and, as a unit, ask us to find wholeness of self, or ourself with the universe. Jupiter, known as the guru or teacher planet, looms overhead. In astrology, Jupiter oversees our soul's journey and the paths we take to discover our spiritual selves. That's a long description. The path on the left is without struggle, but also without reward. The right path shows a mountain adorned with flowers. It might be more difficult, and you will experience obstacles along the way, but experience begets self-respect. Tune into your highest self and begin forming that relationship with love. Love will then find you in unexpected ways. This card may also mean travel, literal or metaphorical, personal or in relationship. This is the alchemical union, referencing love we can find in each other and the ways in which we seek on our own solo journeys. You don't need someone else to catalyze your experience of love. Keep wandering, keep finding and loving yourself. And the keywords are love, harmony, values, balance, self-love, and choice. It's funny. This was actually the card that I pulled after I meditated this morning when I woke up. And, normally I like sit and think about an intention for the episode before I pull a card. And I didn't do that before I started recording this morning. I just decided that the Wayfarer and what it said about love was really sort of related to the questions that I wanted to answer in this episode. And I think there's a way that this thing of understanding that you don't need someone else to catalyze your experience of love. To me, that's the point. And it might feel like the more challenging path at times to take responsibility over and over again, and that the buck stops with me. But there's something about that thing of like, in that it begets self-respect. When I show myself what I'm capable of by being at the end of the day the one who is responsible for my life, I find there is a deep sense of self-esteem and empowerment and belief in myself that I am capable of, that starts to cultivate within us, right? But when our energy is focused outward, we're not really building that sense of self in the way that I think we can. And so, yeah, I love the way that this deck talks about the Lover's card as the wayfarer, and that this is like a journey that you are on to continuously bring the focus back to what you are learning about yourself through the experience of attempting to love others and show up as love in the world. And that's the work, right? With, oh, so much grace and compassion, oh, so much understanding for why it feels challenging at times. But I believe on so many levels, that is not only the work that we came here to do, but that we are growing in our understanding of and our capacity to do it well. So here's to us. And I think we're going to wrap for today. I think, over an hour of me gabbing is probably enough for today, but still have a few spots. If anyone listening would like to join us in Portugal, May 28th through June 2nd, it's going to be an epic trip, and you can find out more information about that through all my social media channels and on the website. And beyond that, just thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thanks for spending this time with me talking about sovereignty in our relationships, one of my absolute favorite things to talk about. And I could go on for hours, but I appreciate you spending this hour with me, and I will see you again soon.